Hachette Audio presents Titanic's Last Secrets. Written by Brad Matson. Read by Henry Leva.
A late-night highway phone call was the beginning of it. When John Chatterton's BlackBerry chirped, he was northbound on the New Jersey Turnpike with the cruise control set at 72, 80s rock on the radio, and a box of fried chicken thighs on the seat next to him. He was staying awake on pure willpower after a long day, knowing that waking up next morning with his wife on the coast of Maine would be a hell of a lot better than waking up alone in a motel room. As much as he liked being home, Chatterton had no complaints about the time he was spending on the road. He had always seen his life as an album of before and after pictures. Before Vietnam, after Vietnam. Before his first wife, after his first wife. Especially before U-869 and after U-869. Since 1997, when Chatterton and Richie Kohler had identified a U-boat they'd found off the coast of New Jersey, exploring shipwrecks was no longer just Chatterton's obsession. It was his job. He and Kohler were the stars of a PBS documentary and a television series, Deep Sea Detectives, diving and getting paid generously to do what they loved to do. Since the U-boat, there had been other before and afters in Chatterton's life, but the shocker was cancer. A squamous cell carcinoma had announced itself as an odd ripple in the familiar terrain of his neck on an otherwise ordinary morning, shaving at the bathroom sink. That discovery had propelled Chatterton into the world of big medicine, which offended him even more than the cancer. But 4 years after the numbing litany of chemo, surgery, and radiation, he was still alive. Chatterton picked up his BlackBerry as the sodium vapor glare of the Turnpike rest area north of Newark flashed by on his left. "John, it's David Concannon. Got a minute to talk?" "For you, lots of minutes," Chatterton said. Concannon was a lawyer in Philadelphia who had hired Chatterton as an expert witness in a lawsuit involving the death of a scuba diver. Concannon was big on the Explorers Club, went to meetings, was the president of his chapter in Philly, and was one of the club's lawyers. Concannon ran a company that gave advice to explorers putting expeditions together. He seemed like a nice enough guy. "So, I've got an idea for you," Concannon said. Chatterton was used to this part of life after U-869 too. Everybody had an idea for Deep Sea Detectives. The premise of the series was simple. Every shipwreck presented a mystery. He and Richie Kohler solved it. Chatterton listened to people who called him with ideas because some of them panned out and some were just good stories. "Let's hear it," Chatterton said. "The Big T," Concannon said. The words hung in cell phone space. The Big T? Chatterton couldn't figure out what Concannon was talking about. "Titanic," Concannon said, breaking the awkward silence. He went on to say that he had been an advisor to an expedition in 2000 that had been picking up Titanic artifacts for a museum exhibit, and something had been nagging at him ever since. At the end of his last dive in a mere research sub, he saw ribbons of steel that looked like they had been peeled from the bottom of a ship. Scattered around them, there was debris, shoes, suitcases, trunks that might have come from a cargo hold. Concannon had talked about the ribbons of steel with others who had been to the wreck of Titanic, but none of them had seen anything like them. "Where are the pictures?" Chatterton asked. "No pictures," Concannon said. "It was at the end of a 5-hour dive and we were out of videotape." "What about stills?" "No stills. I shot some, but the film wasn't advancing in the camera." Chatterton's bullshit detector went off. It wasn't just the coincidence of both video and still cameras going kaput at the same time. Things like that happened. Something in the lawyer's voice, a little too much eagerness maybe, put Chatterton on alert. At the same time, Concannon's story presented him with a classic reward versus risk situation. As the potential reward increased, greater risks, whether of life or money, became more and more tolerable. No underwater mystery in the world upped the stakes like Titanic. After countless ill-fated voyages of ships, it was the most famous wreck of all. Chatterton knew only the outlines of Titanic's brief life and unforgettable death. The ship was as long as 4 city blocks, as wide as a freeway, and as tall as a 9-story building. A Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast built it. The White Star Line owned it. J.P. Morgan owned the White Star Line. Titanic hit an iceberg on its maiden voyage and sank a couple of hours later on the early morning of April 15, 1912. People were still arguing about exactly how the ship sank. It had been built with watertight compartments, which should have kept it afloat until help arrived. But they didn't. There were only half enough lifeboats for the 2,200 passengers and crew, and many lifeboats were less than full when they were launched. More than 1,500 people died. Concannon was still talking. "John, I saw something that might make a difference in what the world knows about how that ship sank," he said. "I can take you right to it. I wrote the coordinates in my notebook." "Who else has seen these ribbons of steel?" Chatterton asked. Concannon told him that neither the sub-pilot, Anatoly Sagalievich, nor the other man, one of the expedition leaders, paid any attention to them. Why not, Chatterton thought. What he said was, "Let me think about it, Dave." Concannon told Chatterton he needed a decision right away. The Russians who owned the mothership Keldysh and the two Mir subs were provisioning for the whole summer of Titanic charters that very week. They had to know if Chatterton wanted the last slot of the year in August. Concannon sounded like a telemarketer trying to close a deal. Chatterton said he would be in touch and hung up. There was something not quite right about Concannon, but another voice was telling Chatterton that if he and Kohler found out what had happened to Titanic, their discovery and identification of U-869 would pale by comparison. Without taking his eyes from the road, Chatterton punched his speed dial to call Kirk Wolfinger, a documentary filmmaker with whom he had been working since the U-boat movie. In 1996, Wolfinger had been scouting for a good story about World War II German submarines and running into one crackpot after another. At the same time, an insane coincidence, Richie Kohler called Nova to ask if the series producers might be interested in the U-boat that he and another diver had found but not yet identified. Nova referred him to Wolfinger. Wolfinger said U-boat leads were like UFO sightings, so how about some proof? A week later, Kohler showed up at the Nova office in Boston carrying a dinner plate. "This came from a submarine off the coast of New Jersey," Kohler said. "Nobody suspected it was there before John Chatterton and I found it. Nobody knows why the sub was there. We intend to find out." Kohler flipped over the plate, revealing the swastika embossed on the bottom. "We do know it was a Nazi U-boat." The Nova boss actually gasped. "We'll do it," he said. 4 years later, Hitler's Lost Sub aired on PBS. A literary agent in New York put Chatterton and Kohler together with a writer who turned their story into a best-selling book, and Wolfinger, Chatterton, and Kohler parlayed Hitler's Lost Sub into deep-sea detectives. "Kirk, my man," Chatterton said when Wolfinger answered the call. "What do you know about Titanic?" "What do you have there, John, a sunken treasure story?" "How about a conspiracy theory that it didn't really sink?" Wolfinger said. "Very funny," Chatterton continued. "Anyway, this guy, his name is Concannon, says he went to the wreck in a submarine and saw pieces of steel that looked like they had been peeled from the bottom of the ship. Didn't you do something on Titanic?" Wolfinger told Chatterton that he had made a film about Titanic's sister ship, Britannic, which sank after hitting a mine during World War I and had learned a lot about Titanic in the process. The American and British investigations into the Titanic disaster took testimony from hundreds of surviving crew and passengers. Half of the survivors seemed to be either lying or describing what they had imagined when they were in shock. Some said the boilers exploded. Some said they didn't. Some said the stern of the ship rose high into the night sky before plunging straight down. Some said it sank without a ripple. The Americans concluded that Titanic had hit the iceberg, flooded, and sunk in one piece. The British said about the same thing. Both blamed only the captain. In 1985, when Bob Ballard and Jean-Louis Michel found Titanic on the bottom in two widely separated pieces, they proved that the official conclusion that it had sunk in one piece was wrong. The current theory, Wolfinger said, was that the ship sideswiped the iceberg and tore a gash about 300 feet long in the hull. The bow flooded, the stern rose at a 35 or 45 degree angle, and the ship broke and finally came to rest on the bottom in two big pieces. A lot of people disagreed with all or part of that scenario. Chatterton interrupted. "Who's a lot of people?" Wolfinger laughed. When he was researching Britannic, he had dipped into the subculture of men and women he called Titaniacs, model builders, artists, the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers Forensics Panel, complete amateurs with too much time on their hands, lunatics, and conspiracy theorists who endlessly debated the events of the early morning hours of April 15, 1912. They argued about everything from the color of the drapes in the second-class smoking room to the number of rivets in the ship, to the possibility that everything after the moment of impact was one big cover-up. The real questions revolved around the extent of the damage from the iceberg, the flooding of the ship, and why it went down so fast. One faction thought if the ship had grounded on part of the iceberg instead of sideswiping it, the bottom of the hull could have ripped open, which would explain why Titanic sank so fast. The first rescue ship, Carpathia, got there a couple of hours after Titanic went down. If Titanic had stayed afloat for just a little longer, 1,500 people who died screaming in the frigid North Atlantic would have still been alive when help arrived. At that moment, Chatterton crossed the point of no return. He could not believe that the real story of the world's most notorious shipping disaster was still his to tell. If there was even a 50-50 chance that Concannon's ribbons of steel really were pieces of Titanic's bottom, he had to do everything within his power to find them. Chatterton was dead sure that Richie Kohler would agree with him. The fallout from U-869 had spun Richie Kohler out of the comfortable orbits of running his glass contracting company, holding his family together, and diving on shipwrecks when he had the time and money. After Hitler's lost sub, he had tiptoed into the world of television with Chatterton, not entirely sure it was a reasonable way to make a living, but willing to give it a try. A few episodes of Deep Sea Detectives convinced Kohler that he couldn't make enough money at it to support his family. So he said the hell with it. He had gotten a divorce, had married again, and was raising his two children. He couldn't take the chance of losing his glass business. Then the book about U-869 shadow divers became a bestseller, and Kohler had enough money in the bank to gamble on diving for a living again. The changes in Kohler's life after U-869 weren't only about making a living. Just before he and Chatterton finally put the pieces of the puzzle in the right places to identify the U-boat, Richie Kohler, formerly known as the Tonnage King, was transformed. His two-story house on a suburban lane in Brick, New Jersey, is a museum of portholes mounted on varnished wood plaques, china etched with shipping line crests, silverware, crockery, bottles, sextants, gauges, chronometers, helms, wheels, engine telegraphs, compasses, binnacles, bells, and builder's plates. Loot. But the exploration of U-869 had the unintended consequence of transporting Kohler into the lives of the men who died on the sub. And his motivation for exploring wrecks changed forever. He still craved the thrill of surfacing with an artifact from a sunken ship, but people had become more important to him than loot. Deep Sea Detectives was in its third year, and Kohler and Chatterton were thriving together even though they didn't necessarily get along all the time. They never had. Chatterton was 10 years older than Kohler. Maybe that was the chasm that separated the two men. Maybe it was that each of them had gotten used to filling up a room on his own. Kohler and Chatterton were like a couple of big dogs of different breeds rescued from the pound by a generous family and installed in the same nice house with plenty to eat. They were never really going to enjoy each other's company, but each of them knew he was better off steering clear of the other's food dish than sitting in a cage waiting for the needle. Kohler always answered his phone when he saw it was Chatterton calling. "So this guy just called me," Chatterton began without introduction. "A lawyer named David Concannon." He talked for 5 minutes, shouted really, as he usually did when he was excited. "Ribbons of steel, no film. Kirk says maybe a documentary deal, but nothing for sure. We have to decide soon. Might mean we each have to put up $100,000 or so. Nobody knows why that ship sank so fast. Lots of theories. We're wreck divers, right? Titanic is the wreck to end all wrecks. What if this lawyer is totally fugazi, John? I've been thinking about that. I can't come up with a good reason to figure he's making it up, Chatterton said. Not to put too fine a point on it, but if we push all that cash into the pot and come up empty, it won't just be the money we're losing. We fall on our asses. A lot of people are going to know about it. I hear you, Richie. How long do I have to think about it? Kohler asked. Chatterton picked up the hesitation in his partner's voice. We won't actually start writing checks for a couple of weeks. Okay, Kohler said. Let's do whatever's next. 10 weeks later, as if they had been fired from a cartoon cannon by that flurry of phone calls in May, Chatterton and Kohler landed on the waterfront in St. John's, Newfoundland. They had drained their bank accounts, pulled some equity out of their houses, and wired $256,000 in cash to the company that brokered the charter for the Russians. The package included 8 days on the 400-foot Keldysh, its crew of 75, and the 2 Mir submersibles for 4 dives each. Wolfinger had not been able to make a deal for a film to underwrite the expedition, but if they found pieces of steel that had been peeled from Titanic's hull, he knew he'd have plenty of buyers for the story and the pictures. Concannon had grown increasingly believable. He had gone through his notes and found the exact coordinates of the tantalizing wreckage he had seen in 2000. He had the location of other debris that could be equally sensational. Pieces of the grand staircase and trunks and suitcases that might have come from a cargo hold. He seemed less like someone going off half-cocked to feed his own ego, and more like a genuine explorer, hungry for the truth. Even without a contract for a movie deal, Wolfinger fronted the cost of high-definition cameras, a cameraman, and a soundman. For the underwater photography, he arranged for the most experienced Titanic cinematographer, Ralph White, and an equally experienced deep ocean imaging technician, Billy Lang, to join the crew. Wolfinger also hired naval architect Roger Long, with whom he had worked on earlier films about shipwrecks. Long designed and built ships, but more important to the investigation into the ribbons of steel, he had 2 decades of experience in maritime forensics and ship stability. Simon Mills, an English historian who had been studying the Olympic-class ships for most of his life, signed up. Bob Blumberg, the U.S. State Department specialist on shipwrecks and salvage treaties, was coming along as an observer. Joe Porter, the editor of Wreck Diving magazine, joined the expedition as its photographer and reporter. Keldysh sailed at dusk on August 10, 2005. After sunset, when the spectacular granite bluffs of Newfoundland had faded to slivers on the western horizon, Anatoly Sagalyevich's voice crackled over the intercom. Everyone was to assemble in the main conference room for a briefing. Captain Yuri Gorbach ran the ship, but Sagalyevich, whom everyone called Tolya, was in charge of the diving. The key members of the expedition team, along with a few others, assembled around Sagalyevich. Kohler had brought his wife Carrie, a qualified wreck diver who was hoping for a seat on one of the Mir dives. Concannon had his new wife Donna with him, along with a friend who ran a dive shop in Pennsylvania, Tom Maddox, and Maddox's son. Wolfinger and his crew moved around the conference room, dipping for camera angles and swinging the microphone boom to record conversations. Sagalyevich opened with a joke. Mir translates to the English word peace, he said, and the name of the mothership, Akademik Mstislav Keldysh, honors a Soviet Cold War rocket scientist who built ICBMs. He laughed. Everybody else laughed. Then he announced that he had good news and bad news. The storm of the past week was leaving. By the time they reached the wreck in 2 days, they should have calm seas for launching and retrieving the subs. The bad news, he said, was that a bigger storm was on the way. They would have to leave a day earlier than planned to make it safely back to St. John's. That meant 3 days of diving instead of 4. To punctuate what he had just said, Sagalyevich looked at Captain Gorbach, seated at the table in his dress-white uniform, who nodded. Kohler and Chatterton locked eyes, both of them thinking the same thing. We just lost 25% of our bottom time. Despite Zagaliewicz's bombshell, the mood of the expedition remained high. The blend of skill and expertise they had assembled was a lot better than Chatterton and Kohler had counted on when they'd made their decision to sign up 2 months earlier. Few people knew the wreck of Titanic better than Bill Lang and Ralph White. Nobody knew the Olympic class of ships better than Simon Mills. And Roger Long was the perfect choice to lead the forensic investigation once they found new evidence. Long had been fascinated with Titanic all his life, but had remained outside the circle of bickering theorists. As an outsider, he would bring original thinking to his interpretation of any new evidence. For Chatterton and Kohler, there was no reason to make a dive unless they had a job to do. They appreciated the beauty of the sea, its creatures, its shipwrecks, and the dance of light underwater, but recreational diving was simply not in them. Neither of them, however, had ever been in a deep submersible. Even with the hoary fear of failure pinging away inside their heads, anticipating a ride in a Mir made them as giddy as the goofiest tourist. All wreck divers are gearheads, and a Mir submersible is the ultimate gear. No vehicle can take a human being deeper into the sea. As Keldysh steamed southeast, Zagaliewicz led the expedition team on a tour of his subs. The 2 identical Mirs were built in 1987 in Finland, but they had been completely overhauled every 5 years, most recently in 2004. They could dive to a depth of 19,680 feet, which allowed them to reach the bottom of 98% of the world's oceans. Each Mir is 25.6 feet long, 11.8 feet wide, and 9.8 feet high, most of that made up of aluminum sheathing. The pressure hull, what keeps the crew alive, is a much smaller nickel-steel sphere with an inside diameter of 6.9 feet. Each Mir weighs 40,920 pounds. It can carry a payload of 640 pounds, which allows for 1 pilot and 2 observers. There are 3 viewing ports. The one in the middle for the pilot is 7.5 inches in diameter. On each side, the ports are 4.5 inches in diameter. All are plexiglass 7 inches thick. Electric power comes from oil-filled nickel-cadmium batteries. The top speed forward is 5 knots. Communication on the surface is by radio, underwater by hydroacoustic telephone, which sends sound waves through water instead of air. For navigation, an array of transponders is anchored to the sea floor at known locations determined by GPS. Zagaliewicz announced the dive plan for the next day, which he had worked out with Chatterton and Kohler. In Mir 1 would be John Chatterton and David Concannon. Zagaliewicz would pilot Mir 1. In Mir 2 would be Richie Kohler and Ralph White, with Genya Chernayev as pilot. "The subs will carry a light meal of sandwiches and drinking water," Zagaliewicz said, adding, "They have no toilets. There are piss bottles for emergencies, but it's better to drink nothing for 6 hours before diving." At mid-morning, 2.5 days after leaving St. John's, Chatterton and Kohler were hunched over the bottom chart of the wreck, reviewing their dive plan, when they felt the pulse of Keldysh's engine slow from the steady throb of cruising speed. Once Titanic had been found, global positioning satellites took all the guesswork out of finding it again. As Keldysh coasted to a stop, Chatterton and Kohler knew they were hovering precisely over the wreck. Just before noon, Richie Kohler walked hand in hand with Carrie across the deck to Mir 2. He waved to no one in particular, kissed Carrie, smiled, and stepped onto the ladder leading to the hatch on top of Mir 2. The instruments, the controls, and the cramped cockpit of the Mir spelled spacecraft to Kohler. He fought it off for a few seconds, but he couldn't temper the sense of pride he felt. He was making a voyage to another world, realizing a dream that had captured him as a boy watching the television coverage of the first Apollo moon mission. In Mir 1, the hatch slammed shut above Chatterton's head. Nothing settled him down more than knowing he was in a place that would forgive no mistakes. He felt the lurch of the crane lifting the sub out of its cradle, then looked out his viewport and saw 24 people lining the rail, waving and applauding. He was amazed at how clear they appeared through 7 inches of plexiglass. Zagalievich toggled switches to sound test alarms, lit up the instrument panel, and triggered the whir of fans and pumps. Concannon talked on the radio to the launch crew on Keldysh, checking the communication circuits. Chatterton made sure the audio and video recorders inside and outside the sub were rolling. Every word spoken during the dive would be on tape. The sub seemed to fall rather than settle into the sea, and began rolling in the leftover chop of the departing storm. Chatterton heard a clamor on the top of the sub. Zagalievich looked at him and with his fingers made a hook leaving a circle. A crewman was releasing the crane cable. The sub bobbed free, rolling and lurching, then descended into the calmer water beneath the surface. The dive plan called for Chatterton and Concannon to land near the stern to begin looking for the ribbons of steel immediately. Kohler and White would land near the bow section and photograph it to document its condition. Microscopic organisms that feed on rusting metal were devouring the hull, and it was only a matter of time before nothing would be left of Titanic but a dark stain on the seafloor. The question was, how much time? There wasn't anything anybody could do about it, but Titanic offered a rare opportunity to measure the phenomenon. After surveying the bow section, Kohler and White would explore the debris field around it with whatever was left of their 5 hours of bottom time. There was no point in wasting electricity on the Mir's outside lights during the descent. Inside, only the glow from the instruments gave firm dimensions to the surfaces of the sphere. Conversation in Mir 2 petered out after a half hour. To Kohler, it was a little bit like the endless hours of hanging on a rope underwater during a long decompression after a deep scuba dive. He entertained himself with unuttered thoughts, glancing up every once in a while to watch the orange numbers on the depth sounder tick over. Mir 2 was a Russian sub, so the numbers read out in meters. At 3,500, Genya Chernayev lit up a part of his instrument panel that had been dark. He was fine-tuning his position and trimming the sub for landing. He flicked on the floodlights. The bottom was 50 feet below, and closing. After 2.5 hours in the dark, the brown muck of the seafloor was entertainment enough for Kohler. His eyes adjusted to the brightness. The bottom was littered with unnatural objects, none of them particularly significant. They just didn't belong there. Chernayev nursed Mir 2 forward. The lumps and hummocks became coal, jagged bits of steel, wire, and other debris that to Kohler's experienced eyes virtually shouted shipwreck. The lights of the sub swept through the darkness like a yellowish flashlight beam on a night trail. New terrain snapped into view as the abrupt edges of the beam reached it, then faded to black as the Mir moved on. Suddenly, without the fanfare that should have accompanied so astonishing a spectacle, the weird light fell on the bow of Titanic. "Oh my God," Kohler said, abandoning all pretense that he, one of the most experienced wreck divers who had ever lived, was not overcome with awe. "Unbelievable. Look at that. Oh, man." It was the railing that rendered Titanic's bow so powerful an image, not because of the King of the World scene in the movie, but because it humanized the wreck. Rails were there to keep people from falling off the ship. People had stood at the rails, waved goodbye, stared out at the sea. Kohler could see them. Mir 2 glided over the remains of the navigation bridge, and there were the stanchions of the helm and engine telegraphs. Chernayev had witnessed the moment of first encounter with the bow of Titanic many times before, and he knew just where to go next for maximum effect. He gave a squirt on his tail thruster and said, "Captain Smith's stateroom." Through the ruptured ceiling of the deckhouse, Kohler saw the glimmering white ceramic rim of Smith's bathtub. Though he knew the absurdity of his next thought, he couldn't keep it out of his head. Kohler longed to be swimming free with a tank of gas on his back, just to be able to touch the ship. In Mir 1, Zagalievich turned on his lights. After the long, passive descent, the sub was alive. They were a half-mile south of the bow section, with the wreckage of the stern coming up a couple of 100 feet ahead of them. As the sub settled slowly, the bottom resolved itself as a carpet of brown mud studded with hard-looking debris. Coal, bits of metal. Sagalievich steered Mir 1 toward the massive target dead ahead that was pinging on his sonar screen. The wreck that greeted Chatterton and Concannon was not as sensational as the intact structures of the bow, but it was far more disturbing. It looked as if 300 feet of a ship, the hull, superstructure, engine room, propellers, and shafts, had been thrown off a 2.5-mile-high mountain onto solid concrete. Every surface sagged toward the bottom from the force of the impact, leaving only the solid steel girders of the two main engines standing in anywhere near their original shapes. The engine frames, as high as 5-story buildings, loomed over Mir 1 as Sagalievich steered past the enormous pile of scrap. Finally, Chatterton saw the proof that the mess outside was really a ship. A gigantic propeller, half its diameter buried in the ancient mud of the seafloor, materialized in his viewport. Like Chernayev, Sagalievich knew what the customers wanted. He gingerly nosed Mir 1 closer until the lights fell full on one of the propeller blades, still a yellowish bronze nearly a century after it turned its last revolution. On the blade, Chatterton saw numbers gradually coming into focus. The 3 numbers made one figure, 401. Every wreck diver searched for positive identification of a ship. An engraved bell, a name etched into the steel of its bow, a builder's plaque. Chatterton knew that he was looking at the builder's hull number for one ship and one ship only. "I'm ready to leave here, Tolya," Chatterton said. "You ready, Dave?" "Let's go do what we came to do," Concannon said. Sagalievich reset his sonar receiver with the coordinates Concannon had given him the night before. He did not get an immediate return from a target, but he adjusted his dead reckoning course in the direction of the spot he estimated to be another half-mile to the southeast. 15 minutes, Sagalievich said. Chatterton and Concannon remained at their viewports the whole time. They talked out of the sides of their mouths to keep from fogging the plexiglass. Sagalievich sounded pleased when he announced that he had acquired a target. Not big, not small. 200 meters. Then, 100 meters. Mir 1 was 10 feet above the bottom, moving forward at 3 knots. 50 meters. "We're right where we should be," Concannon said. "And there's the hill. There's the hill. There's dishes on the hill." Ahead of Mir 1, the bottom wrinkled in a hummock that could have resulted from the impact of something heavy. Chatterton saw the tracings in the mud left by the skids of a previous Mir landing and, on the gently sloping flank of the hummock, the white blips of crockery. In every direction, coal was scattered like black confetti. Then, he saw the shoes. "Oh, man," Chatterton said. "Look at all those shoes. You've got all kinds of stuff here. This is a bona fide debris field." Concannon said, "Oh, yeah, I remember this. I remember all that coal right there. Yeah, this is right. Keep going, keep going." Chatterton loved nothing more than an all-or-nothing moment. "We've got some steel over here," he announced. "What's this?" "Yeah, a piece of steel," Sagalievich said, breaking his usual silence. He had taken so many tourists to do nothing but sightsee on Titanic that he had been swept into the exhilaration of perhaps discovering something new. "This is it. This is right where we were," Concannon said. "I remember that the sand and mud were all humped up like that. We found it. Yeah, baby," he shouted. "There's a big piece of steel." Concannon drew back from his viewport, reached around Sagalievich, and offered his hand to Chatterton for a high five. Chatterton didn't move. What he saw outside looked nothing at all like ribbons of steel. "I was not crazy," Concannon went on. "It's right where I said it was. But what is it?" "It looks like a box beam of some sort," Chatterton snapped. "It's definitely not pieces of the bottom." Sagalievich maneuvered the sub to slowly sweep the debris with the searchlights. The dull metal was a few feet long, flaking with rust, maybe a piece of ducting. There were some smaller pieces that looked like wire or cable. Beyond them, the men saw only the desolate seafloor reaching to the edge of the light and disappearing into the darkness. Mir 1, this is Mir 2. John? Kohler's voice burbled over the acoustic telephone. Richie, this is John. Can you hear me? Yeah, John, I read you loud and clear. You know I'm dying to hear. Did you find the ribbons of steel? Did you find the ribbons of steel? Negative, 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 Chatterton said. When the Keldysh crew popped the hatches on the Mears, nothing was more important to the divers than getting to a toilet. Everybody worked hard at being graceful, but that was the deal. Afterward, Kohler tracked down Chatterton, who was in the galley eating a sandwich. It was after 10. Sagalievich had announced that they would dive the next day, take a day off for maintenance, then make the third and final dives the day after. John, we have to talk, Kohler said. He led the way to a secluded spot on the stern. They leaned on the rail, staring out into the darkness instead of looking at each other. I want to throw that son of a bitch over the side, Chatterton snarled. This has turned into the most expensive sport diving charter in history. Kohler felt the same way, but Concannon and the ribbons of steel were already old news. Even worse than what had happened that day was not knowing what they would do next. They had endless experience investigating sunken ships with scuba gear, which allowed them to return to a wreck again and again. 4 mere dives, representing a total of 8 seats, were the last they and the members of their expedition would ever make to Titanic. They knew that their best bet was to try to find evidence that Titanic had grounded on the iceberg. That scenario still made more sense to them than the sideswipe theory. They had looked at dozens of pictures of icebergs, most of which showed shelves of ice protruding from the 9/10 of the berg that was underwater. There had to be some reason why Titanic went down so quickly, and grounding on the iceberg explained it. Apart from the practical reality of figuring out what to do next, the first dives had transformed their relationship with Titanic. This had happened to both of them many times before. Until they dove on a shipwreck, it was just a name, a rumor, numbers on a chart, and a pile of rotting wood and metal on the bottom of the ocean. After they had been there, they were as involved as if they had boarded the ship at its last port of call before it disappeared into the sea. Chatterton and Kohler decided that they would take the next day off and use it and the following maintenance day to study the tapes from the first dives in hopes of coming up with a solid plan for the final dives. They had promised 2 of the 8 remaining Mir seats to Tom Maddox and Carrie Kohler, both experienced wreck divers who would know how to conduct a search and run the cameras. They could get the beauty shots of the wreck, the bow, navigation bridge, decks, cabins, portholes that would be essential if they found enough new evidence to justify making a film. Roger Long was the obvious choice for one of the seats on the second day of diving. He could take a look at Concannon's ribbons of steel and come up with a second opinion. Most of all, he would know how to interpret other damage that might indicate that Titanic had grounded. The bottom of both large pieces of the hull had never been seen because they were buried in the mud. But on each side of the ship, where the flank of the hull joined the double bottom, were stabilizers called bilge keels. Each of these was 300 feet long and angled downward to reduce the rolling of the ship in heavy seas. If Titanic had grounded on the iceberg, the bilge keels should have been damaged. Most of the length of the bilge keels was buried in the mud, but a few feet, Chatterton and Kohler figured, should be visible just ahead of where the ship broke in two. More than anyone else, Long would know what to look for. Ralph White, who had made more dives to Titanic than anyone but the Mir pilots, would accompany Long. White knew every inch of the wreck and would be able to quickly orient Long to what he was looking at in the narrow beams of the searchlights. This plan gave Chatterton and Kohler 36 hours to decide how to use their last 4 Mir seats on the final day of diving. If Long found even the slightest evidence that Titanic had grounded, they would stick with that. If not, they were back to zero. Roger Long had been one of those funny kids who flunked everything in school, but in 7th grade, he designed an electric combination lock for a cigar box. He built the relays, circuits, and a keypad, turned it on, and it worked. The box wouldn't open unless he pushed the 3 buttons in the right order. Long slogged through prep school in Massachusetts and lived for tinkering and fixing things. During his teenage summers on Quechee Lake in upstate New York, Long learned to sail in a 7-foot boat. He redesigned the little sloop into a traditional catboat, then moved on in high school to designing an 18-foot cruising sloop in meticulous detail. The elegant process of drawing, lofting, and shaping a boat felt better to Long than anything he had ever done. In college, where he still wasn't able to mesh with academic routines, he spent most of his spare time designing another boat. In 1970, Long walked into the Boston office of naval architect Philip Rhodes and asked for a job. Rhodes, who needed a draftsman, hired him that day. Long had planned to go back to school and become a social worker. But 35 years later, he was a naval architect without a college degree. He had learned his trade by working with some of the most respected designers and marine engineers in New England, Chetley Riddall, Paul Luke, and John Gilbert. When Wolfinger had approached Long about joining the expedition, he'd sworn Long to secrecy, then told him about the ribbons of steel. There was no question in Long's mind that pieces of steel torn from Titanic's bottom would change everything about what the world thought had happened to its most notorious wreck. Wolfinger left Long with transcripts of his conversations and interviews with Concannon. He also gave him a stack of magazines from the Titanic Historical Society, a book by theorist David Brown, who championed the grounding theory, and a list of URLs of Internet discussion forums. As they were parting, Wolfinger said, "Roger, you are not going to believe how crazy some of these people are over that ship." Long was not a complete stranger to the subculture of men, women, and children whose lives revolved around Titanic. He was a student of shipwrecks and a marine forensics investigator, and there were no greater maritime mysteries than those surrounding the Ship of Dreams. Long dove into the arcane, passionate, and often absurd lives of the Titaniacs. There were complete lunatics, harmless crackpots, playful reenactors who belonged to clubs, rabid archivists, list makers, artifact curators, amateur sleuths, and highly credible engineers and naval architects. William Barnes, for example, insisted that under hypnosis he became Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews, and he wrote a book about the sinking from Andrews's point of view. Another man believed he was the reincarnation of Captain E.J. Smith. He announced it one night at a dinner at the home of White Star historian Paul Loudon Brown and his wife, who started laughing. Their guest burst into tears and sobbed his way through his story of his terrible death in the icy water, the cries of the dying, the guilt he felt at letting them perish. Though rarely so oddly, fantasy played an enormous part in the lives of the members of the 12 Titanic historical societies in England, Northern Ireland, Ireland, Scotland, South Africa, Switzerland, Germany, Canada, and the United States. All of them had their beginnings as groups of survivors who wanted to get together, preserve their memorabilia, and honor the memories of the dead. The Titanic Historical Society, with its headquarters and museum in Indian Orchard, Massachusetts, for instance, was born in the teenage mind of Edward Kamuta. His father owned a lone movie theater in the village on the outskirts of Springfield. When the Academy Award-winning movie Titanic, starring Clifton Webb, Barbara Stanwyck, and Audrey Dalton, played at the theater in 1953, 20th Century Fox sent a promotional package with the film. Ed's father put up the posters and photographs of the cast in the lobby and gave the rest of the material to him. The first showing of Titanic touched something deep inside Ed Kamuta. Afterward, he spent hours poring through movie reviews, background stories about the real Titanic, and especially a list of the names and addresses of passengers and crew members who were still alive. After Titanic left Indian Orchard, Ed started writing letters. 10 years later, Kamuta and dozens of Titanic survivors had become regular correspondents. As the number of living survivors moved inexorably towards zero, many asked Kamuta to set up a museum in which their menus, silverware, tickets, postcards, photographs, diaries, and other memorabilia would have a permanent home. Kamuta agreed. He founded the Historical Society and set up the museum in the back room of the jewelry store he owned, across the street from the theater where Webb, Stanwyck, and Titanic had changed his life. In the mid-1970s, Kamuta and his equally passionate Titanic aficionado wife Karen started publishing a magazine with articles about the ship, the White Star Line, survivors' accounts, theories about the sinking, and biographies of the passengers and crew. Wolfinger had left Roger Long a few issues of the Titanic Commutator. Thumbing through an issue of the Commutator, Long turned to an ad for the Titanic launch and gala dinner weekend. It was the highlight of the year for the Society, an annual event for which members dressed in period costumes, ate meals from Titanic's first, second, and third-class menus, and danced to a ragtime string band. Ed Kamuta always came in uniform as Captain E.J. Smith. Months before the event, he started growing a beard, which itched and irritated him to distraction. The day after the closing ceremony, Kamuta shaved off the beard. Prominently in the center of the ad for the annual gala, the Society's internet address directed members and prospects to its website. There, from an online store, a visitor could order tickets to the gala, join the Society, read about its history, read dozens of articles from the Commutator, and buy any of thousands of items, including Titanic t-shirts, baseball hats, and coffee mugs, CDs of selections from the White Star Line music book, and 70mm film cells from James Cameron's movie. The release of Cameron's Titanic had coincided with the blooming of the internet in the mid-1990s, and the film threw the world of the Titaniacs into an entirely new dimension of speed and obsession. Soon, Titanic discussion forums, historical websites, diatribes by conspiracy theorists, thousands of photographs, and auctions of memorabilia were a mouse click away. There were hundreds of discussions about the sinking of the ship, and everyone expected to be taken seriously. The wreck had inspired some conspiracy theories that would not die. According to one of them that circulated among Irish Catholics, the Protestant owners at Harland & Wolff and White Star had cursed the ship by naming it Titanic. Reflected in the water under just the right conditions, the Catholics said, the name Titanic read as, "No Pope Here," in Gaelic. A second theory involving religious fanaticism was the Jesuit conspiracy, built around a lunatic fringe that claimed the Jesuits had been in charge of all the significant events in the world for hundreds of years. In 1910, they said, J.P. Morgan, who they claimed was in secret a Jesuit, held a meeting on an island off Georgia to unite his empire with those of the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds to establish a powerful central bank and guarantee funding for Jesuit schemes and wars. 3 extremely rich and powerful Americans opposed Morgan's grand plan: Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, and John Jacob Astor. Titanic was then nearing completion at the Protestant stronghold of Belfast. To eliminate the opposition, the Jesuits commanded Morgan to make sure Guggenheim, Straus, and Astor were aboard Titanic for a voyage to America that they would never complete. The next part of the plan was to order Captain E.J. Smith, also a Jesuit, to arrange the accidental sinking by running at full speed through a known ice field. Titanic, its passengers, and its crew would be sacrificed to get rid of 3 men. Another theory drew far more attention than No Pope Here and the Jesuit conspiracy. The Switch, which inspired several books, endless threads of blather on the internet, and a movie, proposed that Titanic was really Olympic. Even after the wreck was discovered and positively identified, thousands of people contended that a collision with HMS Hawke had fatally damaged Olympic. Repairing Olympic would have taken months, maybe years, and cost more than the hull and machinery insurance would cover. So White Star secretly switched the ships, sank Olympic as Titanic, and collected the insurance. In 2004, the most recently published book, Olympic and Titanic: The Truth Behind the Conspiracy, debunked the theory. The authors spent 200 pages doing it. Long moved on from the absurd. He dove into the thicket of theories on the sinking that he found in hundreds of internet discussion threads and more books than he could possibly read. Everyone agreed on only 2 facts. Titanic had hit an iceberg. It was totally gone 2 hours and 23 minutes later. Everything else about the disaster was debatable. Most of the arguments revolved around the extent of the damage. Some theorists believed the iceberg punched holes in the first 3 of the 16 watertight compartments. Others said the first 4 compartments were affected, the first 5, or even the first 6. Titanic was built to stay afloat with up to 4 compartments flooded, but not with 5. Nobody had proved anything conclusively about how badly the iceberg damaged the ship. When Titanic's bow plowed into the bottom of the ocean, it was moving at about 35 knots, faster than it had ever gone on the surface. The impact drove the front 300 feet of the ship into the ancient mud of the bottom, all the way up to the anchors. There was no way to see the damage caused to the bow by the iceberg. In the absence of hard evidence about the damage caused by the iceberg, the Titaniacs had 3 theories regarding the impact itself. Titanic either sideswiped the iceberg, grounded on the iceberg, or both. There were 2 subsets to the sideswipe scenario. The big gash theory held that the iceberg tore open the steel or popped rivets along 300 feet of Titanic's side, from the first compartment called the peak tank back to Boiler Room 5. A few theorists, who were marginalized by the others, supported the even bigger gash theory, which damaged the ship back to Boiler Room 4. Small gash theorists claimed that the damage extended only as far as Boiler Room 6, the one closest to the bow. The grounding theory was a wild card. If the ship ran over an underwater shelf that tore open part of the outer bottom, there would have been flooding, but Titanic should have been able to stay afloat on its inner bottom. If the ice tore open both inner and outer bottoms of 4 or more compartments, that would explain why the ship sank so fast. Among the proponents of the grounding theory, Long discovered a charter boat captain, boat builder, and obsessed Titanic historian named David G. Brown. Like millions of people, Brown had tumbled into the Titanic whirlpool because of James Cameron's movie. He was moved by the beauty of the ship and the human tragedy. But Brown instinctively doubted the dramatic scenes in the movie in which the stern rises to a 45-degree angle before the ship breaks in half. Brown painstakingly constructed a second-by-second chronology of the disaster based on the testimony and accounts of survivors. He studied diagrams of the ship until he was as familiar with it as he was with the floor plan of his house in Ohio. Brown studied the accounts of the collision, testimony about the damage by officers and crew, and came up with a combination of the small gash and the grounding theories. But he did not think the damage was anywhere near as severe as commonly assumed. Titanic, Brown believed, sank far more quickly than it should have. He was, of course, jeered by those Titaniacs who disagreed with his theory. And he jeered back at them. What interested Roger Long most about Brown's contrarian perspective was his concentration on the behavior of the ship's officers, crew, and passengers in the hours after the impact. Brown insisted that for 2 hours they did not behave like men who thought they were on a sinking ship. Except for its captain, E.J. Smith, its designer, Thomas Andrews, and its owner, J. Bruce Ismay, who acted as if the ship had been doomed even before they finished inspecting it for damage. What did they know that no one else aboard Titanic knew? Long pulled himself out of a spiral of supposition. Brown was a Titaniac, he reminded himself. But as a contrarian himself, Long was inclined to believe that Brown might be onto something. Long was more skeptical of the hidebound theory of the sinking that had been published by the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers in 1995. SNAME, founded 20 years before Titanic went down, policed its profession by reviewing papers, books, and licensing exams and creating panels for advancing the interests of marine engineering. Long had a copy of the forensic panel's paper, The Titanic and Lusitania, a final forensic analysis. The lead author was William Garsky, a member of Gibbs & Cox, a naval architecture firm that had designed, among hundreds of other ships, the last great transatlantic ocean liner, SS United States. Garsky and his co-authors based their conclusions on videographic evidence and observations from expeditions to the wreck in 1985, 1986, 1991, 1993, and 1994. They said that the 300-foot gash could not have happened as claimed by Edward Wilding. the Harland and Wolff engineer who testified at the British inquiry. Wilding had calculated the weight of the water required to sink the ship, the size of an opening required to admit enough water to match that weight, and determined the total size of the opening to be 12 square feet. That would require a tear in the hull 3/4 of an inch wide and 300 feet long. The Garsky report quoted the pilot of the submersible Alvin, with which the wreck was first explored. No metal sword known, much less a sword of ice, could make a continuous 3/4 inch wide slice in 1 inch thick steel without dulling or breaking. We now conclude that the gash is non-existent and should be considered as folklore, Garsky wrote. But the report offered only speculation as to what kind of hole, gash, string of popped rivets, or other opening could flood the ship fast enough to sink it in 2 hours and 23 minutes. Garsky and his co-authors calculated the effects of flooding the bow in the time between the impact and sinking and offered their most sensational conclusion. The stern of Titanic had risen out of the water at a 45-degree angle before either breaking on the surface or following the bow down and breaking off during the fatal plunge. Now, Long thought, I see where James Cameron found his most terrifying scene for the movie. As it had been with everyone who saw Titanic, the horrible specter of the man falling hundreds of feet from the stern into the propeller was indelibly etched into Long's mind. The Garsky report was interesting, but Long did not see any hard evidence to validate its author's conclusions. The extent of the damage was critical, and nobody really knew how badly the hull was breached or how the ship had broken and sank. When Chatterton and Kohler asked him to make a mere dive to Titanic, Long felt like an audience member suddenly dragged on stage during a magic act. They had told him it was extremely unlikely that he would make a dive, but the vanishing ribbons of steel changed everything. They needed his eyes on the bottom, Chatterton and Kohler said. "We need you down there, Roger," Chatterton said. "Okay," Long paused, "but I told my wife I wasn't going down in the sub." "No worries," said Kohler. "We won't tell her." The next day, Long's restless night of pre-dive jitters vanished when he reached the top of the ladder, took off his shoes, put them in the yellow dry box a crewman held next to the open hatch, and lowered himself into Mir 1. He made conversation with Ralph White and the pilot, Genya Chernayev, for a half hour, then fell asleep. 2 hours later, Genya woke him, turned on the lights, and did a radio check with Mir 2. Long lay on his belly, his forehead against the leather pad over his viewport, his face an inch from the plexiglass. He was right where Chatterton and Kohler wanted him to be, looking at the torn metal at the broken end of the stern section. Long directed White in videotaping the edges of the steel at the points of separation between the two sections, capturing the patterns of fracturing, tension, and compression. He was not exactly sure what he was looking for, but if there was a story to tell, the steel would tell it. After an hour of nosing around the frightening, jagged gash where Titanic had come apart during its death throes, Long asked Genya to take him to the starboard side for a look at the bilge keel. Genya steered well away from the hull to avoid cables and tangles of debris, then approached slowly, the skids of the sub just 2 feet above the bottom. The side of the ship appeared first as a black blot against the brown mud. Then Long could make out the overlapping steel of the hull plating. There, right in front of him, the bilge keel. Long could clearly see the 2-foot-wide slab of red-painted steel protruding from the side of the hull right where it met the bottom. He asked Genya to take the sub slowly toward the bow at the same height. Long was hoping to see rumpled and torn steel on the bilge keel to take the grounding theory from the realm of supposition to possible reality. But no. From the point of the break in the hull until the bilge keel disappeared into the mud as the bow dug into the seafloor, its red anti-fouling paint wasn't even scratched. For another 2 hours, they cruised over a strange part of the seafloor etched with canyons 30 feet deep, then over a debris field that was interesting but nothing new, and finally over Concannon's junk. Still junk, Long concluded. Some kind of box beam or ducting, and definitely not a piece of the bottom of Titanic. The day after Roger Long surfaced with the dismal news that the grounding theory was impossible to prove, Chatterton and Kohler sulked around the ship. While the Keldysh crew used the day to check out the mirrors, they sat in front of the video monitors and watched the film of the worthless debris from the first dives and the disappointing images of the pristine bilge keel from the second. The voice of self-recrimination in Kohler's head never stopped. How could he have missed the obvious fact that he was risking a small fortune on the word of one man he'd never even met before? Chatterton, too, blamed himself. He understood that when you were looking for things no one had ever found, sometimes you didn't find them either. But he should have known better than to trust an eager, chatty lawyer instead of his own gut. Like Kohler, he had to admit that pride had reached out to slap him down. Billy Lang, the imaging technician from Woods Hole Wolfinger had hired for the underwater camera work, had seen plenty of deep ocean expeditions implode under the pressure of runaway egos, poor planning, and bad luck. Expeditions had pecking orders. What Lang had just witnessed was a shuffling of that order, because the man who was on the top, on whose word others had spent a small fortune, had been demoted in the harshest possible way. The expedition was about to get ugly. Lang was a compact man, graying as he approached 50, carrying the extra weight of age on a sturdy frame with a low center of gravity. He moved with the efficiency of someone who thought about what he was going to do before he did it, and he spoke with the same restraint. For 25 years, Lang had worked at Woods Hole building underwater cameras and imaging equipment for exploring the deep ocean. He and a small cadre of other inventive men and women designed and built instruments that took the place of eyes where humans could not go. Until Lang's generation of engineers had intersected with the technology to shield instruments from the deadly pressure, the abyss had hidden its secrets for all of the 200,000 years Homo sapiens had existed. Attempts to find out what was under the surface of the sea began the first time human beings stuck their heads into the water and opened their eyes. Alexander the Great had himself lowered a few feet into the Mediterranean in a glass barrel on the end of a rope. In 1690, Edmund Halley, who discovered the comet that bears his name, invented a chamber that could be lowered into the water to depths of 40 feet and resupplied with air ferried down in skin bladders. Freedivers held their breath, swam 60 feet to the bottom, and for a minute or two looked around for oysters that might yield pearls. Divers in heavy copper helmets couldn't go much farther than the pearl divers, but they could stay down and walk on the bottom as long as someone on the surface pumped air through a hose to them. For millennia, the unfathomable mysteries of water pressure, blood gas, and the limitations of muscle power defeated attempts to dive deeper. Then, in 1934, William Beebe and Otis Barton had themselves sealed into a 4.5-foot diameter, half-inch thick steel sphere with 3 quartz glass portholes and dropped at the end of a cable into the Atlantic off Bermuda. Their first dive took them to 800 feet and made them international heroes, celebrated on the front pages of newspapers as stupendously brave travelers to another world. 4 years later, they reached a depth of 3,028 feet. In the primitive craft they called the bathysphere, they became the first humans to go beyond sunlight into the eternal darkness of the deep ocean. In 1960, Don Walsh and Jacques Piccard dove the submersible Trieste down to the deepest place in the ocean, a depth of 7 miles. In 1964, Woods Hole built the highly maneuverable 3-person sub Alvin, which could reach a depth of 14,764 feet. For the expedition to Titanic, Lang brought 2 high-resolution Sony studio cameras he had modified to fit into 6-inch diameter titanium housings. The cables from the cameras went to high-speed digital tape recorders inside the sphere. With high-intensity TV lights mounted on arms outside the sub, it was a straightforward, simple system. Even someone running the cameras for the first time was likely to get it right. Lang usually worked quietly in the background. He was content with tinkering, preparing, making sure that every camera he sent into the depths at enormous cost and risk of life worked perfectly. He went to planning meetings but tuned out anything that did not relate to imaging. There was nothing sweeter to him than an important discovery that happened because of his wires, cameras, and steel. In 1985, however, Billy Lang had moved to center stage during an expedition to search for Titanic. It was the latest in a succession of attempts to reach the wreck, the first of which had been announced on April 20th, 1912, 5 days after the disaster. Vincent Astor, the son of John Jacob Astor, who had been aboard Titanic and was presumed dead, said he would return to the scene immediately, blow up the wreck with high explosives, and recover his father's body when it floated to the surface. The following day, the steamer Mackay Bennett found the frozen body of J.J. Astor in his life jacket among hundreds of his fellow passengers and crew, and Vincent canceled his expedition. 50 years passed before a team of British adventurers chartered a salvage ship named Help and tried to find Titanic using an array of explosions that were supposed to create a profile of the ship on the bottom. They were at Titanic's last reported position, but their bombs returned no shapes of a ship to the sonar receivers and no debris floated to the surface. For most of the 1970s, Douglas Woolley, a young Englishman, dominated the search for Titanic with his plan to find it, photograph it, raise it, and bring it to Liverpool to become a floating museum. He claimed salvage rights to the wreck and raised millions from investors, to whom he promised shares of a $500 million fortune in gold, diamonds, and vintage wine. Woolley vanished in 1977, never having found Titanic. Soon after Woolley's escapade collapsed in a heap of lawsuits and bad press, oceanographer Robert Ballard of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution proposed a venture with the more modest goal of simply finding the wreck. Ballard talked the Aluminum Company of America into loaning him its drilling ship Alcoa Sea Probe. He would lower 12,400 feet of pipe in 60-foot lengths. At the end of the pipe, instead of a drill bit, would be a heavy steel pod loaded with side-looking sonar, still cameras, and television cameras. With the pod a few feet from the bottom, the ship would tow it and the connecting pipe through the water. Ballard told the Institute that his search for Titanic would serve as a test of what could become a revolutionary system for studying the floor of the deep ocean for the first time. Ballard sailed from Woods Hole on schedule in October 1977, confident that 10 or 12 days of searching with the Alcoa Sea Probe pod would be all he'd need to find Titanic. He was testing the system in shallower water when a coupling broke, sending 3,000 feet of pipe, weighing 61,000 pounds, to the bottom. Ballard didn't give up on Titanic, but instead of pipe, he next decided to use a camera and sensing pod towed along the ocean bottom at the end of a cable. He formed a company called Psionics International to raise money to build deep-towed sensing and imaging equipment. For a while, Ballard had Roy Disney, Walt's brother, interested, but he backed out at the last minute. A Texas oil man, Jack Grimm, offered to buy into the venture, but Ballard didn't like Grimm. He turned him down, even though it meant he was stalled in his quest to become the man who found Titanic. Grimm tried again with some other scientists but failed to find the wreck on 3 expeditions plagued by rough seas, equipment failures, and bad blood. They found hard targets with their towed sonars but couldn't confirm any of them as wreckage from a ship. On the night of September 1st, 1985, Bill Lang and another imaging technician, Stu Harris, were an hour into their watch in the control room aboard Noor, the mothership of the Ballard-Michelle expedition to find Titanic. They sat side by side staring into television monitors at images from a camera on Argo, a contraption that carried cameras in pressure-proof housings they had built themselves. Towed on a cable behind Noor, Argo was gliding a few feet over the bottom, 12,400 feet below, its lights shining on a few hundred square yards of rocks and muck. Noor's around-the-clock watches had been combing the bottom with their robot eyes for 5 weeks, checking out targets from earlier sonar scans of the area and searching the area in a systematic grid pattern. After more than a month of nothing, the team's edge of anticipation had long worn off. It was entirely possible, they knew, that earthquakes or underwater landslides had completely covered the wreck and they would never find it. They maintained their concentration as well-trained pros, but boring had begun turning up more frequently in log entries on their watches. They played music. They amused themselves by predicting the exact time they would find the wreck on a particular watch. They sat quietly. They fought to stay awake. "There's something," Harris said, shortly before 1 a.m. It would not have been the first false alarm or practical joke for the tired crew. Lang looked over Harris's shoulder and saw shapes on the screen that were definitely man-made. "Wreckage!" Lang shouted. A moment later, a technician monitoring Argo's sonar signals said he had a hard contact. Then nothing. Some boulders slid under the camera. They had seen plenty of those. A minute later, more shapes jumped out from the natural patterns of the seafloor. Harris was in charge of the watch. He decided to wake up cinematographer Ralph White to begin filming the debris. Then they saw it. A circle in the mud. Nature rarely made perfect circles. Harris switched cameras, leaving the forward view and moving to the higher resolution of a camera pointed straight down at the bottom. They saw 3 smaller circles in part of the arc of the larger one. There was no question. It was a ship's boiler, identical to those in a photograph they had of the boilers on Titanic. Minutes later, the pictures streaming up from Argo showed enormous pieces of the wreck. Word of the discovery spread through the ship. The control van was jammed with people slapping each other on the back and drinking cups of Mateus wine. White was commanding Argo to snap still pictures every 8 seconds, sending a spectacular montage of the wreck flashing across the screens. After 20 minutes, Ballard announced that he was going back to the fantail of the ship for a moment of commemoration. Everyone who was not busy keeping Argo alive and on course followed him. Just after 2 a.m., at about the same time of the night the Titanic disappeared into the sea, Ballard unfolded a red and white flag, clipped it to the sternpost lanyard, and let it fly into the breeze over the North Atlantic. In the center of the flag were the gold initials H and W against a black diamond, the emblem of Harland and Wolff.